The boy didn't cry out. He just stood there on the cobblestones, small and very still, like something inside him had already made peace with being knocked down, and the only question left was how long he'd have to stay there. Jin Dae-hyun saw him before she heard anything. She had been cutting through the side street behind St. Andrew's Preparatory School, the same way she did every Tuesday. Head down, earbuds in, running 15 minutes behind on a life that never seemed to slow down enough for her to catch it. The route took her past the wrought iron gates on the way to her Korean language class at the community center 3 blocks south, a practical decision made 2 months ago after she'd concluded that in this city, in this corner of it, some walls came down faster if you could speak through them. A woman originally from Chicago had no business being in a neighborhood this polished, this old money quiet. The wrought iron gates alone probably cost more than her entire apartment building. She had stopped being bothered by that contradiction weeks ago. But she had not stopped noticing things. That was the part of herself she couldn't turn off. The boy was maybe 7, 8 years old. Navy blazer, gold-crested sweater, a striped tie knotted the way someone had taught him carefully and lovingly that morning. His oversized backpack sat upended on the cobblestones beside him, notebooks splayed open, pages fluttering in the cold afternoon air like something wounded. He was looking at the ground. 2 older boys stood over him. Blazers, too. Same school, same uniform, different posture entirely. Dae-hyun pulled out one earbud. She heard the smaller boy before she understood him, a broken, stumbling sound caught somewhere between a word and a breath, trying hard to form into speech and failing each time in front of an audience that found the failure entertaining. The taller of the 2 older boys mimicked the stutter back at him. His friend laughed. Something very old and very certain moved through Dae-hyun's chest. She wasn't a woman who made long decisions. She was a woman who moved. Her bag was already coming off her shoulder as she crossed the cobblestones. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply stepped between the 2 older boys and the child, square and unhurried, like a door closing, and looked at the taller one with an expression that had ended louder arguments than this on far rougher streets. "Walk away," she said, quietly. Once, the older boys looked at each other. Something shifted in their faces, the recalculation of people who have just understood that the person in front of them is not afraid of them at all. They walked away. Dae-hyun didn't watch them go. She was already kneeling on the hard cobblestone, her black puffy vest bunching at the sides, her braids sweeping forward as she reached for the scattered notebooks with one hand and rested the other gently on the boy's blazer-covered shoulder, her maroon sleeve pushed back against the chill. Up close, she could see his face properly, flushed, wet at the corners of his eyes, his small hands still gripping the strap of his overturned backpack like it was the last solid thing in the world. She didn't ask him if he was okay. He wasn't, and they both knew it. She just stayed there, kneeling on cold stone in a neighborhood she didn't belong to, gathering someone else's notebooks, waiting the kind of patient, unhurried wait that said, "I'm not going anywhere. Take all the time you need." The boy looked up at her. His eyes were dark, serious, and startlingly composed for a child who had just been crying. He was taking inventory of her the way children do when they haven't decided yet whether to trust someone. Studying her face, her posture, the steadiness of the hand on his shoulder, looking for the angle, looking for what she wanted. She met his eyes and didn't flinch. Something in his small frame settled. Just slightly. Just enough. She handed him his notebooks one by one. She almost didn't notice the silence at first, the kind that descends when people stop breathing. But she felt it a half second before she understood it. The afternoon had gone very, very still. Even the wind seemed to reconsider itself. The boy's eyes moved past her shoulder and stayed there. His hands, which had just loosened on the backpack strap, found it again. Tighter this time. His chin dipped. Not in fear exactly, in something older than fear. The recognition of inevitability. Dae-hyun turned her head slowly. The black Range Rover had not made a sound pulling up. It simply existed now where it hadn't before. Massive, gleaming, engine idling with the low patience of something that knew it would never be rushed. The driver's door stood open. A second man in a dark jacket was already stationed at the rear. And the man walking toward her across the cobblestones, tall, broad-shouldered. A charcoal gray suit so precisely tailored, it looked less like clothing and more like architecture. The collar of his black shirt was open at the throat, and the dark, intricate lines of his tattoos crawled up from his chest and curled toward his jaw. The kind of ink that didn't come from a parlor you could find on Google. His hands were at his sides. His pace was unhurried. His eyes were locked directly onto the scene in front of him, and they contained something that had no name in polite language. Behind Dae-hyun, somewhere in the middle distance, she heard the two older boys make a sound she had never heard teenage boys make before. A very small, very sincere sound. The sound of people who have just understood what they have done. The man's gaze swept once over the scattered notebooks, over the boy's flushed face, over the upended backpack on the cobblestones. Then it landed on Dae-hyun. She was still kneeling, still holding a notebook, still completely, stubbornly in the space between this man and this child, because she had not yet received a single reason to move. She did not know his name. She did not know that his name was identical to hers. She did not know that half of this city's underworld arranged their schedules around his moods. She did not know what the tattoos meant, what the Range Rover meant, what the stillness of every person within 30 feet of this gate meant. She just knew that there was a little boy behind her who had already been frightened enough today. So she stayed where she was, looked up at the most dangerous man she had ever been within arm's reach of, and waited to see what he would do next. The afternoon held its breath. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. He stopped 3 feet from her, not because he had reached his destination, but because he had chosen to. There was a difference, and Dae-hyun understood it instinctively in the way you understand the difference between a door being closed and a door being locked. This man did nothing by accident. Every inch of the distance between them had been calculated. She stood up. Slowly, deliberately, her braids sweeping back over her shoulders. She wasn't going to stay on her knees for him. She didn't know who he was, but she knew what kneeling in front of someone communicated, and she hadn't kneeled for anyone since Chicago. Behind her, the boy had gone completely silent. The man looked at her for a long moment. Not through her, not past her, at her. The way people look at something they are genuinely trying to understand. His jaw was set. The tattoos at his collar moved slightly with his breathing. His eyes traveled once to the boy, took in the wet face and the disheveled uniform and the notebooks now gathered neatly in Dae-hyun's arms, and then came back to her. She waited. He spoke in Korean first, then watching her expression, switched to English without breaking rhythm. Your name. Not a question. An expectation. Jin Dae-hyun, she said. Something moved across his face, too fast for her to read it. He looked at her for another beat, then reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket and produced a card. He held it out. She took it, because refusing would have been a different kind of statement, and she hadn't decided yet what kind of statement she wanted to make. She didn't look at the card. She looked at him. He turned then. One motion, unhurried, final. The way a man turns who has never once in his adult life had to check whether people were paying attention to him. He walked back toward the Range Rover, and the second man in the dark jacket fell into step half a pace behind without being told. But before he reached the car, he stopped. He turned his head just enough to look at the two older boys, who were still standing exactly where Dae-hyun had left them, blazers wrinkled, faces the color of old chalk. He didn't speak to them. He simply looked. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Whatever he communicated in those seconds, it worked. The taller boy made a sound like something leaving his body permanently. His friend's knees appeared to stop functioning correctly. They moved away from the gate in the manner of people trying very hard not to run while every nerve in their bodies was screaming at them to run. The Range Rover door closed. The engine, which she realized she had never actually heard start, carried the vehicle away from the curb and down the street and out of sight. And the afternoon slowly, cautiously, began to remember how to be an ordinary afternoon again. Dae-hyun stood on the cobblestones and looked down at the card. No title, no company name, just a number, and 2 words, printed in clean dark type. Jin Dae-hyun. She turned it over. Blank. She looked at it for a long time. Then she tucked it into the pocket of her vest. He picked up the boy's backpack from the ground and handed it to him properly, straps first. "You good?" she asked. He took the backpack. He looked at her with those serious, dark eyes. Then he gave her one careful nod, the way children nod when they mean it more than adults do. She walked home. She didn't throw the card away. The black SUVs were there when she woke up on Thursday. Not 1, 3. Parked in a neat row along the curb outside her building on a street where the nicest vehicle most mornings was her neighbor's 2009 Civic with a mismatched door panel. They were the kind of vehicles that had no business being in her neighborhood and seemed entirely unbothered by that fact, which she found both impressive and deeply annoying. She stood at her window in her socks and her oversized hoodie, coffee going cold in her hand, and understood that she had 2 choices. She could pretend she hadn't seen them and see how long the pretending lasted, or she could go downstairs and deal with whatever this was on her own terms, in her own time. She finished her coffee first. Then she changed. The man who approached her in the lobby was not Boss Jin. He was younger, quieter, with the stillness of someone trained to occupy space without drawing attention. He handed her a phone without preamble. The screen showed an address. "Mr. Jin requests your presence," the man said. She looked at the phone. She looked at him. Does Mr. Jin always send 3 cars for 1 person? He sends what the situation requires. She thought about the card still sitting on her kitchen counter. She thought about the boy's face on the cobblestones. She thought about the way the man had looked at her. Not with threat, not exactly, but with the attention of someone who had decided she was worth the looking. She handed the phone back. "Give me 5 minutes." She took 7. On principle. The estate sat behind walls that didn't feel like security so much as a statement. She was brought through 3 checkpoints without anyone raising their voice or their weapon, which somehow made the whole thing feel more serious. Not less. The house beyond the walls was enormous in the way old money is enormous. Not flashy, just permanent, like it had always been there and had simply decided to let the rest of the world grow up around it. She was shown to a room she later understood was not quite a sitting room and not quite an office, designed to feel neutral but functioning as neither. So the boy was there when she arrived. He was seated at a heavy wooden table with a book open in front of him that she suspected he hadn't been reading. He looked up when she came in, and something in his small face shifted. A quiet adjustment, like a compass needle settling north. She sat across from him. "Hey," she said. He looked at her. "You remember me?" He nodded. "Once?" Carefully. They sat in easy quiet for a moment, and she had the thought, not for the first time in her life, that children were often far better company than the adults trying to manage them. Boss Jin entered without announcement. He never announced himself, she would learn. He simply arrived. Today he had shed the bespoke jacket. His sleeves were rolled to the forearm, and the tattoos that had been half hidden at the school gates were now simply present, intricate and dark against his skin. A map of something she didn't have the language to read yet. He stood at the far end of the table and looked at the two of them with an expression she could not name. Then he told her the number. She kept her face very still. She had a gift for keeping her face still when her insides were doing other things, a skill refined over years of negotiating rent extensions and salary discussions with people who expected her to be easy. But the number he named was not a salary. It was a different category of thing entirely. It was the kind of number that changed the shape of a person's future. Live in, he said. His companion. His tutor. His... He paused, not searching for the word but seeming to weigh it. Protection. She looked at the boy. The boy looked at the table. I'm not a bodyguard, she said. I know what you are, Boss Jin said. And the way he said it, quiet and final, told her that he had made inquiries about her life in the 48 hours since the cobblestones, and that the inquiries had satisfied him in ways she hadn't been consulted about. She found that irritating. She also found it, against her better judgment, slightly reassuring. She looked at the boy again. He had looked up now. Those serious dark eyes, that small, patient face. The boy who had stood on cold stone with his notebooks on the ground and not made a single sound of self-pity. What's his name? She asked. Seo Jun, Boss Jin said. And yours? A pause. Jin Dae-hyun, he said. She blinked. He watched her process this. Jin Dae-hyun, she said, her voice perfectly level. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had said difficult things to difficult people in difficult rooms for many years, and was entirely unbothered by the resulting silence. That's my name, she said. I'm aware. We have the exact same name. Also aware. She pressed her lips together. She was not going to laugh. She was absolutely not going to laugh in the living room of a mafia boss with tattoos up his neck, who had just offered her more money than she had made in the last 3 years combined. She was a grown woman and a professional, and she had been in stranger situations than this, and she was not going to laugh. She laughed. It came out small and involuntary, barely more than an exhale, but it was genuine, and once it escaped, she couldn't entirely call it back. She pressed her fist to her mouth, but looked at the ceiling, collected herself. When she looked back at him, his expression had not changed, but the quality of his stillness had, the way a room changes when a window opens somewhere out of sight. Not warmth, not approval. Something that had no comfortable name, from a man who had probably decided a long time ago that comfortable names were for other people. Seo Jun was watching both of them. He had the expression of a child who understood more about the adults in the room than the adults would prefer. Call me Day, she said. Just Day, so we don't lose our minds. Boss Jin considered this with the gravity of a man considering a treaty. Fine, he said. She moved in on Saturday. She found her rhythm with Seo Jun, the way you find a rhythm with anyone who doesn't trust language yet. Slowly, without pressure. Or through the accumulation of ordinary moments. She read to him in the evenings, first aloud and then with long pauses where she waited, unhurried and undemanding, to see if a word might come on its own. She played cards with him at the kitchen table. She taught him to make her grandmother's cornbread from a recipe she carried in her memory, standing beside him in the estate's vast, gleaming kitchen that looked like it had never been used for anything as human as cooking, guiding his small hands through the measurements. She didn't push him on the speech. She had learned a long time ago, in neighborhoods where silence was sometimes the only safe response to a dangerous world, that you couldn't reach into a person and pull the words out. You had to make the room quiet enough and safe enough and patient enough that the words decided to come on their own. So she made the room quiet. She made it safe. She waited. Seo Jun began to meet her eyes more often. He began to stay in rooms where she was. He began to reach for her hand when they walked the long corridors of the estate, and then catch himself and not quite reach for it, which told her everything she needed to know about how much he wanted to and how much he had already learned to distrust wanting things. She let her hand drift slightly closer. Just enough. Not enough to be noticed. Enough to be there. Boss Jin watched all of this from the margins. She would catch him in doorways, in corridors, at the far end of rooms, not hovering exactly, but present in the way a man is present when something has earned his attention, and he hasn't decided what to do with that yet. He said very little to her directly. When he did speak, it was precise and purposeful, the language of a man who had learned at some point that words were a resource you didn't spend carelessly. She respected that, even when it frustrated her. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks into her residency in the estate, she was in the library with Seo Jun, pointing at a word in his reading book and waiting while he gathered himself to say it, when she became aware that Boss Jin had appeared in the doorway behind her. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the boy and kept her expression steady, and kept the quiet steady, and waited. Seo Jun's eyes moved to his father, then came back to the page. He started. The stutter caught him. He stopped, took a breath. She didn't fill the silence. She didn't finish the word. She just waited, in the way she'd learned to wait, with her whole body, not just her face. See, castle, Seo Jun said. Fully, cleanly. One word, but his. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She nodded once, the way you nod when something was always going to happen and has now simply happened. That's it, she said quietly. From the doorway, she heard nothing. No movement, no sound. But she knew he was still there. She could feel it, the weight of a man paying the kind of attention he didn't usually give to anything that wasn't a threat or a transaction. She didn't turn around. She just turned the page and pointed to the next word and waited. She heard it before she understood it. It was late, past midnight. The estate settled into its nighttime configuration of locked corridors and distant footsteps and the low, persistent hum of the city beyond the walls. She had been awake for no good reason. The restlessness that comes from sleeping in a house that belongs to someone else's life and hasn't quite admitted you into it yet. She had been sitting at the window in her room with her knees pulled up and a book she wasn't reading. The sound came from the east wing. Not a shout, not a crash. Something lower and more deliberate than either. Voices in a register that meant something was happening that wasn't meant to be heard. She told herself it wasn't her business. She sat at the window for another 4 minutes. Then she put her book down. The east wing corridor was dimly lit and longer than she remembered from the daytime. She moved quietly, the way Chicago had taught her to move in hallways where you didn't know what was behind the next door, and stopped when she reached the half-open room at the end. Through the gap, she could see enough. The man in the chair was not someone she recognized. He was middle-aged, sweat-soaked, his hands tied behind him with a professionalism that told her the knots had been done by someone who knew what a knot was actually for. 2 of Boss Jin's men stood at the walls. Boss Jin himself stood in front of the chair, jacket off, rolled sleeves, and he was speaking in a voice she had never heard from him before, quiet and terribly unhurried, the voice of someone who has all night and would genuinely prefer you understood that. She could not hear every word. She heard enough. She heard a location, somewhere in the south of the city, a name she recognized from the news, and then a sum of money, stated with the flat affect of a man for whom numbers that size had long since stopped being remarkable. She heard the man in the chair make a sound that she suspected he would be ashamed of later if he had a later. She watched Boss Jin crouch to the man's eye level and say something in a register so low it barely moved the air, and watched the man's entire body respond to it like a current had passed through. She stepped back from the doorway. She stood in the corridor with her back against the wall and her heart beating the way it beat during moments that insisted on being taken seriously. Her hands were still. Her face was still. But something inside her was having a very honest conversation with itself about what she had just seen and what it meant, and what kind of man she had agreed to build a life alongside, even temporarily, even professionally. She had grown up around hard men. Chicago had not been gentle with her education about what the world contained. She did not have illusions. She had known in the abstract what boss gin was. But knowing a thing in the abstract and watching it happen 12 feet away from you in a corridor you now lived in were two different kinds of knowledge. She pushed off the wall and walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about it properly, the way she thought about important things. Not quickly, not emotionally, but thoroughly, turning the whole situation over until she could see all its sides. Hiseo Jun's face. The word castle arrived at slowly and held like something precious. The card on her kitchen counter. Jin-dae Hyun. Two words for two different people, or maybe for the same kind of person in different shapes. She still wasn't sure. She thought about the little boy down the hall who reached for her hand and then stopped himself, who had learned very young that wanting things sometimes cost more than you could afford. She lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. She didn't leave. If this story has you hooked on Jin-dae Hyun and everything she has walked into, hit subscribe and ring the bell right now because the next chapter is coming and it will not let you sleep. Comment below, Team Dae, who stayed when every door was open for her to leave, or Team Boss Jin, a man who didn't know his empire was missing something until she knelt on those cobblestones and refused to move. And if you're watching from outside the country, tell me where. I want to know how far this story is traveling. See you in the next one. The storm came in from the west on a Tuesday night, the kind that didn't announce itself gradually but arrived all at once. Rain against the windows like something demanding to be let in. The estate felt different in storms. The high ceilings and long corridors amplified the sound until the whole building seemed to breathe with it, and the lights in the older wings flickered occasionally in a way that the generators corrected for immediately, but that still made the dark feel closer than usual. She had been in Seo Jun's room reading to him when the thunder started. He hadn't flinched at the first crack of it, which told her something. Children who were afraid of storms flinched. Children who were living with something louder than storms inside them simply looked at the window and went quiet in a different way. She closed the book and set it on the nightstand, and didn't say anything for a while. The rain moved against the glass in long sheets. Somewhere in the east wing, a door settled in its frame. Seo Jun was sitting up in bed with his blanket pulled to his waist, looking at the window. His hands were in his lap, very still. She waited. He was there, he said. She didn't move. She kept her breathing even and her posture soft, and her eyes on the middle distance rather than directly at him, because she had learned that direct attention sometimes made the words go back inside. He stopped. The stutter caught him at the article, held him there for 3 seconds that she counted silently. At the meeting. Another stop. He pressed his lips together. She watched him decide, with the courage that belongs specifically to children and that adults largely forget they once had, to keep going. Uncle Sue, he was too telling them. The other men, he was telling them where we would be. The room was very quiet except for the rain. She turned to look at him then, slowly, the way you turn toward something fragile. His face was flushed in the low light, not from crying, but from the effort of it. The enormous effort of stringing those words together and holding them up long enough to hand them to someone. He was looking at her now, straight at her, with the expression of a child who has been carrying a specific and terrible thing for a very long time and has just set it down and is waiting to see if the person he set it down in front of is going to be able to hold it. She held it. "You saw this," she said. Not a question. Quiet. Steady. He nodded. "And you tried to tell your father?" Something moved through his face. The shadow of a memory that had left marks. He nodded again. smaller this time. She understood then. Not just the stutter, but the shape of it, where it had come from, what it had cost him to have the words fail him at the exact moment they had mattered most. A child who had known something and could not make his mouth say it in time. A child who had been carrying the weight of that silence ever since. She reached over and put her hand over both of his in his lap. She didn't speak. There was nothing useful language could do here that presence couldn't do better. After a moment she said, "You told me." He looked at her. "You told me," she said again gently, "and I'm going to make sure it gets to where it needs to go." She sat with him until the storm moved east, and his breathing evened into sleep. Then she sat for a while longer, her hand still resting near his, thinking about Uncle Sue and what it meant that a man trusted enough to stand in the inner circle had been standing there looking outward, and how long Seo Jun had known, and how heavy that was for a set of shoulders that small. Then she went to find Boss Jin. He listened to her in the way she had come to recognize as his particular form of attention. Completely still, completely present, his eyes on her face without interruption. She told him everything Seo Jun had said, as precisely as she could, in the order it had come. She didn't editorialize. She didn't soften it. She gave him the information the way he had always given her instructions, clearly and without waste. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "He told you," he said finally. "Yes." He said the name. He said the name. She watched something move through Boss Jin's expression that she had not seen there before. Not anger. Not yet. But something underneath anger. Something more primary. A pain that belonged specifically to fathers. The understanding that his child had been alone with a terrible knowledge and unable to reach him with it. She watched him absorb it and say nothing and absorb it further. "He's sleeping," she said. "He was okay when he went to sleep." "Oh, I think he felt better." Having said it. Boss Jin nodded once. He didn't look at her. He was looking at the far wall at something only he could see, and his jaw was set in the way she had learned meant he was deciding something, not feeling it. The feeling would come later, privately, in whatever way this man allowed himself to feel things. Right now he was deciding. She left him to it and went back to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. The ambush happened on a Wednesday, which was the most ordinary day of the week, and therefore exactly the kind of day you didn't see things coming on. She had been walking back from the market 2 streets over from the estate, a small, deliberate habit she'd maintained because she refused to let her entire life shrink to the perimeter of someone else's walls, no matter how well guarded those walls were. She had a canvas bag in one hand, and her phone in her jacket pocket, and her braids tied back, and she was thinking about what to make with Seo Jun for dinner, because he had, in the days since the storm, become suddenly and almost aggressively interested in cooking, as though the unlocking of one thing had loosened several others. The car came from her left. She felt it before she processed it, a wrongness in the movement of the vehicle, too slow for the street, and too deliberate, the crawl of something that has found what it was looking for. She turned her head and saw the window coming down and understood in the 3/4 second before anything happened that this was the shape of a very specific kind of trouble. She dropped. Not away, down and sideways, behind the stone pillar of the nearest doorway, the canvas bag hitting the pavement and spilling, and she pressed herself flat against the stone and felt the air above her change, and heard the sound of men exiting the vehicle with more urgency than they'd planned for. 2 of them. She catalogued this in the way Chicago had taught her to catalog threats. Fast, without panic, just inventory. 2 men, one already moving to cut off her left side, one still near the vehicle. The one near the vehicle was on a phone. His expression was wrong for a hit, too confused, recalculating something. She heard him say a name into the phone. Her name. Her full name. And then, "She's not him. It's the woman." a compression in the line that she could feel even from where she was pressed against the stone. The men looked at each other with the expression of people who have walked into a situation that is not the situation they prepared for. It was the fraction of a second she needed. She moved left, fast and low, using the parked cars along the curb as cover the way she used the city's bones, as resources, as geography, as something to put between herself and whoever wanted to reach her. She heard shouts behind her. She did not look back. Looking back cost you half a step, and half a step was a negotiation she couldn't afford right now. She ran 4 blocks before she understood she had lost them. She stopped in a doorway on a side street, breathing hard, and looked at her hands. Steady. She was always steadiest in the middle of things, had always been that way. The adrenaline smoothing rather than spiking, a quality she'd never entirely understood in herself but had learned to rely on. She pulled out her phone and called the estate. Boss Jin answered on the second ring. She told him where she was in as few words as possible. She heard a compression in the line, like pressure building behind a sealed door. "Stay where you are," he said very quietly. She stayed where she was. 3 minutes later, the black Range Rover turned onto the street. She did not see him again until the following morning. His men brought her back to the estate, and there were people moving through the east wing with a purposefulness she had learned to recognize as the prelude to something being addressed in the way Boss Jin addressed things. And she went to her room and sat on her bed and let the night finish itself without her. In the morning, he came to the doorway of the kitchen where she was making coffee and stood there looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not softened exactly, but stripped of one of its usual layers, like something he normally wore for everyone's benefit, had been set aside for the moment. "You're not hurt," he said. "No." He nodded. He looked at her hands around the coffee mug. "They were after you," she said. Not accusatory, just naming the thing. "They were after Jin Dae-hyun," he said. "They didn't know which one." She thought about this. She thought about 2 men exiting a vehicle with a name on their lips and arriving at her face instead of his, and the recalculation that had moved through them. "Well," she said, "that's a design flaw in the naming situation." Something changed in the set of his jaw. Not much. Enough. The way a foundation shifts just before a building decides what it intends to do. "I'm going to handle it," he said. "I know," she said. And she did know, in the way you know things about people after you've watched them up close for long enough. She knew how he handled things. She had seen it in the corridor at midnight, and she had made her peace with what she'd seen, and she was still here. That told her something about herself she was still in the process of understanding. She poured a second mug of coffee and set it on the counter beside her. She didn't look at him when she did it. He looked at the mug for a moment. Then he picked it up. They stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet and drank their coffee and did not talk. And it was, she thought, the most honest thing that had happened between them yet. The Founders' Gala was the school's largest event of the year, and nothing about it should have gone the way it did. The grounds were dressed up, lanterns along the stone paths, tents on the lawn, the kind of orchestrated elegance that cost more per table setting than Dae-hyun's first apartment. She had brought Seo-jun early, at his request, because he wanted to see the string quartet set up, a preference she found so genuinely charming that she'd moved 3 things in her schedule to accommodate it. Boss Jin had meetings across the campus with the school's board. His men were positioned at intervals she had learned to map by habit. It was supposed to be a safe night. She heard the first sound at 8:14. Not a shot. Something before a shot. The atmospheric shift of organized violence entering a space that didn't know it was coming. She felt it in the back of her neck before she understood it, and she was already reaching for Seo-jun's hand when the first shout went up from the east side of the lawn. "Come on," she said. Not loudly, not urgently enough to spike his fear. But her hand was firm around his, and she was already moving. She took them through the service entrance of the main building, the route she had memorized in the first week, out of a habit she had never been able to turn off. Always know the secondary exit. Always know the room behind the room. The library was on the second floor, northern corner, reinforced doors, because the school was 400 years old and had been built when reinforcement was just called building. She got them through the door and got it bolted behind her and stood with her back against it and listened. And Seo Jun was behind her. She could hear him breathing, fast but controlled, trying to control it. "Hey," she said, without turning around. "Stay behind the reading tables. Low." She heard him move. She heard the tables shift. She already had her phone out. 4 words sent to the estate number, North Library, second floor, before she pocketed it and faced the door. Below, the sounds were getting louder and then abruptly closer. Footsteps on the main staircase, not the careful footsteps of someone navigating an unfamiliar building, but the direct footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Someone had done reconnaissance. Someone had known about the library. She picked up the heaviest thing within reach, which was a brass bookend the size of a small brick, and stood beside the door rather than behind it. Oh, the bolt held for 40 seconds. Then the door came inward with the force of something mechanical, and the first man was through before it had finished moving. She hit him with the bookend before he cleared the frame. He went down hard. She was already stepping over him toward the second, who was faster than she'd accounted for. He caught her by the shoulder, and she let the momentum carry her sideways and down rather than fighting it, because she had learned in circumstances she didn't talk about, that the ground is only a disadvantage if you stay on it, and she didn't stay on it. She came back up with her elbow at an angle that made the geometry work in her favor, and the second man made a sound that told her something had gone wrong in the region of his jaw, and she put herself back between them and the reading tables and stood there, her breathing hard, with blood on her sleeve that she was fairly certain was not hers. The first man was getting up. She heard the window on the north wall blow in. A simultaneous breach. She understood in the half-second it bought her, designed to fracture the room's attention before the door was taken from the other side. She heard a sound she had never heard before, but recognized immediately as the sound of a very specific kind of man who has just arrived and is no longer interested in negotiation. She stepped back. She put herself against the reading tables and put both arms back on either side of Seo Jun without looking away from the door. Boss Jin came through the corridor at a pace that was not a run but covered ground the way a storm front covers ground, inevitable, consuming, rearranging the air in front of it. He had 2 of his men with him, and he did not give any orders she could hear. He didn't need to. The men in the room had 4 seconds to understand what had arrived, and then the 4 seconds were gone, and so, efficiently and finally, were the men. She stood with her arms around Seo Jun and did not look away. When it was over, and it was over quickly, in the manner of things that Boss Jin decided were over, he crossed the room to them. He stopped in front of her. His eyes moved over her face, her arms, her sleeve. His expression was doing several things simultaneously, and she let him do them. Then he looked at his son. She felt Seo Jun move from behind her. She let her arms loosen. The boy stepped forward and looked up at his father, and Boss Jin crouched, all the way down, suit and everything, on the floor of a library with broken glass behind him, and Seo Jun walked into his arms, and Boss Jin held him with both hands and closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. She looked at the ceiling. She gave them those 3 seconds without an audience. What happened in the weeks that followed, she understood later as the city rearranging itself. At the time, it looked like silence, a specific, heavy silence that descended over the estate and the neighborhoods around it and the corridors of the underworld. She had come to understand better than she'd intended. Boss Jin moved through it the way he moved through everything, without announcing himself, without explaining, simply going from point to point and leaving behind him a series of concluded conversations. Uncle Sue was concluded. She didn't ask the specifics. She knew enough. The school issued a brief statement about a security incident during the gala. 2 board members requested emergency meetings with the headmaster, The string quartet quietly canceled their autumn booking. The cobblestones outside the main gate were pressure washed on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday, the school had resumed its careful, expensive silence as though the whole thing had been a weather event, unfortunate, temporary, and not to be discussed at pickup. Co June knew too, in the way children know things, not through information, but through the change in the air, the hollow where a presence used to be. He sat with her 2 days after, and didn't speak for a long time, and then said, clearly and without a single interruption, "Is my father safe now?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He picked up his book. She sat with what had just happened for a moment. A full sentence. No hesitation at all. As though the thing that had been blocking the words had simply been removed now that the words had done what they needed to do. She said nothing about it. She just turned her own page. Boss Jin found her that evening on the terrace, which was the first time he had sought her out in a space that wasn't a kitchen or a corridor or a room with a specific function. She was sitting with her knees pulled up and her braids loose over one shoulder, looking at the city lights beyond the walls, doing the ongoing, unglamorous work of processing everything that had happened in the past several months and figuring out who she was on the other side of it. He sat beside her, not across from her, beside her, or close enough that the silence between them was a different quality of silence than usual. "He spoke today," she said. "Full sentence. No break." "I know." He paused. "I heard him." She looked at the lights. "You stayed," he said. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It wasn't a question. It was something more specific than either, an acknowledgement of a choice she had made repeatedly, small choice by small choice, corridor by corridor, storm by storm, and had never made loudly. "I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "After the East Wing, after what you saw. After that, yes." He looked at the side of her face. She could feel it. Why? She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about important things. She thought about Seo Jun's hand almost reaching for hers in corridors. She thought about the word castle arriving cleanly after so much effort. She thought about the coffee mug on the kitchen counter and the way he had picked it up without making it a thing. "Because the boy needed someone to stay," she said. "And then I guess I did too." He said nothing for a long time. Below, the city did what cities do. It kept moving, kept generating its ambient noise of lives in progress, indifferent to the weight of the moment on this particular terrace. "Jin Dae-hyun," he said. She turned to look at him. "It's going to be confusing," she said. Indefinitely. She had never seen his face do what it did in that moment. Not open exactly, but yield, the way something yields when it has held itself closed long enough and finally decides the cost is too high. It lasted 3 seconds. She looked away and gave it the privacy it deserved. "Yes," he said. "I expect it will be." The school's spring recitation event was held on a Friday morning with parents seated in the old stone hall and morning light coming through the high windows in long, useful slabs. The children were arranged on a small stage with their names printed in the program, and the hall had a quality of public tenderness that only exists when small people are about to do something brave in front of large ones. She sat 3 rows back. Boss Jin sat beside her. His men were at the doors in the configuration she had learned to read as present but not anticipating, which was a different posture from the configurations that meant other things. She had learned to read all the configurations. She read this one and felt her shoulders settle. Seo Jun was 5th on the program. When his name was called, he walked to the front of the stage with his hands at his sides and his St. Andrew's uniform pressed and exact. The tie knotted the way someone had taught him carefully and lovingly that morning. She had been that someone, and the crest on his blazer catching the light. He looked out at the hall. He found her first. She gave him nothing dramatic, just a slight nod, the way she nodded at him when something was always going to happen and now simply was. He found his father. Boss Jin was very still, the way he was still for things that mattered. Seo Jun looked back at the hall. He drew a breath. He spoke. He spoke clearly and steadily and without interruption, the words coming out in their proper order and their proper shape. He filling the old stone room and reaching the high windows and coming back down again. It was a short piece, 8 lines, something about seasons and return, and he delivered every syllable of it as though he had been doing this his whole life, as though the silence that had preceded this had never existed, as though this version of him was the only version there had ever been. She did not cry. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm and breathed through her nose, and absolutely did not cry in a school hall in front of a Mafia boss and 45 families she didn't know. The hall applauded. She felt Boss Jin move beside her, a small shift, a slight lean, his arm against hers. And she did not move away from it. She stayed where she was. Present, grounded, exactly where she was. Oh, in the way she had always been in situations that turned out to matter. On stage, Seo Jun stepped back to his place in the line. He didn't search for them again. He didn't need to. He knew they were there. She had known, standing on cobblestones with someone else's notebooks in her arms, that she was stepping into something. She hadn't known what. She hadn't known the name of the man behind her, or the weight of the silence in the boy in front of her, or the shape the next several months would cut through her life. But she had chosen, each time the choice presented itself, to remain. The choices had accumulated quietly, corridor by corridor, storm by storm, until they had become something that looked like courage from the outside and felt from the inside, like the only reasonable thing to do. She looked down at her hands in her lap. Her braids were loose today, falling over the shoulders of her jacket, and her black sneakers were clean, which felt like a small and honest form of optimism. Beside her, Boss Jin did not speak. He didn't need to. She had learned to read the configurations of his silence too, the one that meant calculating, the one that meant decided, the one that meant something else entirely that she was still naming, slowly and without rush, the way she did most things that mattered. This one was the last kind. She let it be there. She let the morning light come through the high windows, and the children file off the stage, and the hall begin its quiet dissolution into parents and programs, and the ordinary sounds of a Friday that had no idea it was remarkable. She let herself be exactly here, exactly this. No plan beyond it. That, she had learned, or was enough to start with. Can Boss Jin tell the difference between the woman who saved his son and the dangerous world now hunting her, using her own name against her? And what does it mean when the deadliest hit in the city is ordered on a name that belongs to 2 completely different people? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because this story is about to get so much darker. Comment below and tell me, did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you completely off guard? See you in the next one. It's